Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 5 game from the Chicago Open. Now, if you followed the round 4 video, you know that I really got my behind handed to me in round 4 and was demolished from the board in 23 moves against Grandmaster Pavlo Vorontsov. And I was hoping to kind of have a better showing here because I really did not get into the game in that one. Now, my opponent in this one was an individual by the name of Seth Homa, a FIDE master from the United States, who I believe is from Michigan. I'm not sure if he's still in Michigan, but I believe he's from Michigan, and actually has 2 international master norms. So, very, very tenacious player, and obviously knows his stuff. If he's has a few IM norms, he hasn't gotten there yet, but he's 2300 FIDE and can really play. So I was not taking this one lightly at all. In any case, I was white, so I was hoping to put some pressure on him from the jump, and yeah, we'll see what happens. So I opened with knight f3, not my usual starting move, but I did notice something from his openings that I kind of liked, that I thought I could potentially attack, because he went for d5, and after g3, he played knight f6, bishop g2, and e6. And what I liked about this particular move order with the first 3 moves in a fianchetto is that if they're playing d5 and e6 and they're pretty much a queen's gambit decline type of player, sometimes it can be beneficial to delay the movement of the d4 pawn because you cut out some lines of the Catalan with bishop b4 check. So to show you what I mean, let's say I start with my normal move d4, and then he goes d5, c4, e6. Again, he's a queen's gambit decline player. Knight f3, knight f6, g3. Well, here he might also play bishop e7, but another line that's quite possible is bishop b4 check. And this check is fairly annoying and very useful. The point being to misplace one of white's pieces to block this check. So if I play knight c3, I actually am sacrificing the c pawn, and I might not want that. And if I go knight bd2, the knight is actually kind of misplaced on d2, unfortunately, because it's just not as good there, and it's really dominated by this pawn on d5 from the standpoint it can't move forward from there. And then if I go bishop d2, which is the most popular move, then the black bishop drops back to e7, and the argument is that this bishop on d2 is actually misplaced, and there's going to be a tempo wasted to redeploy it from d2 probably to f4, or sometimes even back to c1. So essentially, those bishop b4 checks lines are actually quite decent for black, and I didn't want to allow that, so instead I opted for this knight f3 g3 move order because there's no check on b4. So after e6, I castled, and again, you can see there's no check on b4, and this is kind of like another way to transpose to some of those systems I wanted to play. So now c5 was played, and that's one way that black can actually challenge this setup, is saying, you know what, if white's not going to play d4, I'm going to just take the center myself. And that makes a lot of sense. And essentially, this is a perfectly reasonable system for black, but it's also fine for white. And one of the things I like about playing the white side of this is white's already castled and black isn't. And so it's almost like a reverse to Grunfeld from the standpoint that I can choose to attack the center with c4 or d4 now and get a very playable position. I elected to play c4 because I wanted to open up this diagonal for the bishop. And black has a few options here. Black can either push with d4, they can leave the pawn tension and go bishop e7, or they can take on c4. So let me show you the 2 moves he didn't play. So if you play bishop e7, actually this kind of invites me to go for a terrace defense. So after c takes d5, e takes d5, and d4, I get to play against the potential Isolani on d5. And these types of positions are slightly better for white in most cases because it's, practically speaking, sometimes difficult to have to deal with that nagging isolated pawn. Another way to go is d4, and d4 actually transposes into reverse Benoni's most of the time. The point is that after d3, knight c6, and e3, white is essentially 2 tempos up on the normal lines. The reason I say 2 tempos up is, first of all, white is actually playing a black opening, but is white, so they're already a tempo up. And then I'd say 2 tempo because normally this pawn on e6 and the Benoni is actually on e5, already reinforcing the center. So after e3, bishop d6 takes. If black really does want to elect to reinforce the center with e5, that wastes another tempo. So white tends to have, pretty decent chances here. And a lot of times the black player isn't used to playing, the white side of a Benoni, so it can actually be quite uncomfortable. So, yeah, this is absolutely a viable option. Although black is not worse here either. It's just from a psychological perspective, it sometimes is just different to play, to have this type of role reversal that typically doesn't happen. So, yeah, those two moves, bishop e7 and d4, are very viable. But the move Seth decided to play was actually d takes c4. And this line actually has a reputation as being extremely solid. And we're going to talk a little bit why that's the case in a few moves. So anyways, after d takes c4, the diagonal is open for my bishop, so I'm happy about that, but I need to recover the c4 pawn. So the cleanest way to do that is actually knight a3. A funny little move, moving the knight to the side, but the point is, when it comes to c4, it's really active and it's influencing a lot of squares in the center, and there's no effective way that black can protect the c4 pawn right now. So knight c6 was played, knight takes c4, bishop e7, b3, trying to develop this bishop, another one on the long diagonal, and then after castles, bishop b2. And this is actually a critical place to stop, if you will, because right now the contours of the position are nearly set. Essentially, white has an extra center pawn in some ways with the d and e pawn versus just the e pawn, but black is actually quite comfortable with this position because the c5 pawn does a great job of bearing down on d4. So black's argument is that after I trade the c pawn for the d pawn, that he's going to have pretty good development and counterplay on the c and d files and likely equalize. White's argument, on the other hand, is, well, not so fast. Maybe I can play d4 and open things up, and maybe my bishops can cut along these diagonals and exert real influence on the center, especially because my knights are so active. On the flip side, white can also play a little bit slower and say, you know what, I'm not going to play d4. I'm instead going to play d3, and I'm going to try and needle your queen side, and in particular the c5 pawn, and try and maybe go rook c1 and a3 and try to make that pawn a target, because if you play b6, this diagonal might be sensitive for my bishop. So that's kind of the tug of war right now that is going on. And a lot of times in the system, black does something that is a little bit surprising, and Seth did in this game, and we'll get into it in a moment. So after bishop b2, black went queen c7, and I'm not sure if this is actually the most precise move to get the position that we got in the game. Instead, well, queen c7 is fine, but another move that's also an option is knight d5. And the point is that you kind of shut down this long diagonal right away, or at least try and shut it down. Note that e4 isn't particularly desirable because I weaken these squares on the d file, and after knight db4, it seems like black is quite active here. So that wouldn't be necessarily the move that I'd play. But after knight d5, white can play d4, and after b5, knight e5, takes, and bishop b7, this position is actually quite viable for black, because once this bishop is on the long diagonal, it's not as easy for the white squared bishop to take advantage of it being open, because it has an opponent finally. And so all that's left for black to do is to protect this bishop so it's not the knight isn't pinned, and then usually trades can happen and black tends to equalize. So this is another way that that black can play, and this has actually been played before. I saw games with d takes c5, bishop takes c5, and rook c1 in the database. And yeah, I mean, I think white has a slight edge, but nothing too serious. So yeah. But anyway, queen c7 is absolutely fine. And after queen c7, I actually have a choice here, and I actually can choose essentially between d4, rook c1, or knight e5. Now, all the choices are somewhat viable, and I went for rook c1, but d4 is also a move. It looks a little bit counterintuitive to push this pawn when it's kind of inviting rook d8. But the point is that after knight e5, taking the pawn on d4 can be a little bit tricky because after rook c1, I have so much pressure on the c6 knight that the d4 pawn will be corralled eventually. And well, I found these positions to be relatively close to equal after analyzing them. So, but it was another option to go for. And there is some tricky dynamism connected to the tactics on c6 because you can see I nearly have 4 pieces that can converge on that square. So that was an option. And then also knight fe5 was an option, actually, putting pressure on the c6 bishop or the c6 knight right away. Point being that if black does nothing, let's say like h6, now I could take on c6 and spoil black's pawn structure. And this would be essentially a dream scenario for white. And I believe a strategically winning position because now I can go rook c1 and after d3 just pick off these weaknesses on c5 and c6. And my knight on c4 is kind of unscathed by any pawn pushes because there's no b and d pawns to harass it. So this would be actually a dream for white and a disaster for black. Instead, after knight fe5, there's bishop d7, and well, I could play this position where I secure the 2 bishops, but black has a little bit more space in the middle, and we'll get into this in a moment because a transposition of this actually happened. So anyways, after rook c1, black did go rook d8, and then, you know, this definitely discourages d4 now, I thought. So I thought, you know what, I'm just going to go for knight fe5. And my idea was to just put more pressure on this c6 knight. Now, bishop d7 was played, and this is actually one of the first critical positions of the game because, you know, black's rooks are connected, and he does have a good control of the d4 square. So the question is, if I don't do something in the next few moves to get some type of strategical imbalance or something to play with, black will equalize quite comfortably. So there are pretty much 2 ways to play the position here. One way is to actually try and keep the knight on e5 a little bit longer, and the other way is to actually take this bishop on d7 that's available for the moment. Now, I took the bishop on d7, but if I decide to play, you know, a little bit longer with the knight on e5, I could go for the move f4. This move is extremely double-edged because I am pushing my f-pawn and weakening this diagonal, but I'm trying to get some play potentially on the f-file, and I'm discouraging black from exchanging on e5, because if knight takes e5 is played, I might just consider f takes e5, and maybe the f-file gets opened up, and that's an asset for my queen and rook to potentially come in the game. Or I could also just play knight takes e5, and you know, maybe if the bishop moves back, maybe f5 is in the cards. But I wasn't so comfortable with this f4 move because it seemed like a very much like a short-term play. And if you understand or followed my playing style and my games, you know that I prefer kind of the long, grinded-out affair. And so f4 is fairly short-sighted, and if black kind of beats back at that initiative, then it's not something that's going to be good in the long run. So instead, I played knight takes d7. And after queen takes d7, we have another kind of critical position, if you will, because essentially I have the 2 bishops, which is, you know, known in chess to be an asset, but black is doing a really good job of controlling my pawn breaks, in particular b4 and d4. So the question is, how do I, you know, improve my position meaningfully with the 2 bishops, given that black has this really excellent clamp on the d4 square, and likely will wind up being able to trade the dark square bishops, because if this knight comes to d5, after bishop f6, my bishop on b2 is going to be traded. So you pretty much can envision, even from here, that my bishop on b2 will be gone, and it will be up to me to prove that my bishop on the long diagonal is an asset that merits some type of long-term play and advantage. Now, I'd actually been somewhat familiar with this system because I'd played against it once before, and actually in 2018 against Grandmaster Tanguy Ringor from Belgium. And that game ended in a draw, and it actually really taught me quite a bit about just how solid the system is. Even though black is giving up the 2 bishops, black is extremely solid, and you can see the rooks are connected, and again, the control of the d4 square. So it is a tough nut to crack, but I tried to make something happen. So I started with the move d3. idea with d3 was to just make sure that d2 pawn was well protected, and now my queen is free to roam, and my knight doesn't have to guard the d2 pawn anymore. Fair enough. Now black went for rook a c8. Good move. Getting the rook out of this diagonal and, just also staying prepared for potential b4 and d4 breaks. Now I went knight e5, deciding to trade these knights and get the pure two bishops ending that we were talking about, two bishops versus bishop and knight. But it might have been a little bit smarter to keep this knight just because it is fairly active, and maybe if black would be inclined to play b5, I might get some play against the pawns. So instead, it could have been another decision to just play queen d2 and just wait a little bit and just see if black decides to try and challenge this knight in any way. Because the knight is extremely active on c4, covering a lot of nice-looking squares. And again, a move like b5 I'd be thrilled to see because it would all of a sudden mean that the queen side would be kind of weak, and especially the pawn on c5 would be weakened. And so it'd be quite risky to go for this type of line. So instead, after queen d2, a better move would be just b6, keeping everything solid. And after rook fd1, h6, black has enough waiting moves to play here. But at least I would, test my opponent to actually make some of them instead of lashing out. Because lashing out would give these bishops space to operate. So instead I went knight e5, and then of course an exchange happened because he didn't want to get double pawns. And so knight takes e5 was played, bishop takes e5. And now knight d5 was played. And this is actually a really good move. And the point is that you're just preparing bishop f6 and getting rid of my quote-unquote two bishops advantage. So I went queen d2, connecting my rooks. And now black went bishop f6. And you can see there's this exchange operation happening. And it's actually kind of in black's favor to do this because, having a little bit of... having the two bishops deficit and trading one of the bishops alleviates some of the burden on your position. And with black having like a nice little space advantage, it actually alleviates some of the congestion so that he can hone in on the d4 square. Now, typically when you're the side with more space, you actually don't want to trade pieces. But in actual fact here, the only thing that gives black the space in his position is the c5 pawn. Otherwise, he's kind of playing on the last few rows. So trading some of these pieces so that he might be able to, get some more control is actually not a bad idea. And again, I can't avoid this trade. So I played bishop takes f6, and after knight takes f6, the question is, what should white do here? I have this lovely bishop on the diagonal, but as you can see, only the b pawn is, actually on that diagonal for me to target, and it's probably going to go to b6 in a moment, and then it's going to just be hitting air pretty much. So the question is, how do I get some type of advantage here? And the way that I thought I could consider was by looking at one of my pawn breaks. So the two pawn breaks in this position that I have are d4 and b4, both challenging the c5 pawn. And it seemed like d4 would be extremely unrealistic given that, black already has three pieces on the square, and that b4 would be a little bit more realistic. But the issue is that I can't really go for b4 right away because black has c4 pinning my pawn on d3 because my queen behind it is hanging. So I was thinking that maybe b4 would be the pawn break I'd want to execute, but I couldn't do it right away and I'd have to kind of prepare it. The other thing I was wondering too is that even if I did get b4 in a best case scenario and he had to trade on b4, would I really be able to win? Would I really be able to win one of these pawns on the queen side and get some type of 5 versus 4 on the king side? So in a dream scenario, essentially what I'm saying is after I play b4, c takes b4, queen takes b4, and then somehow I get some pressure with my bishop and my rooks on the open files where I actually manage to trade these two pawns for my only a pawn and then get an ending like that. But even in that best case scenario, then it also begs the question, well, is that winning? Just having a 5 versus 4 on the king side, bishop versus knight, is that actually a winning position? And it probably is really good winning chances, but I think it kind of illustrates the point I'm trying to get at, that black is actually extremely solid here, and no matter what happens, it's going to be difficult to really break black's defense. So I think this is a fairly solid line that's actually worth a try if you're kind of struggling to find something against this like English Catalan hybrid where they delay playing d4. Anyways, I went for queen a5. I thought that was a way to probe the queenside pawns, and I thought maybe it made sense to provoke the b6 pawn push. Instead, like I mentioned before, I could have tried to prepare b4, and I could have done that by playing like rook c2, and then, you know, if b6, rook fc1, and you can see I'm getting closer to playing b4, but again, I wasn't so sure how good b4 actually meant for me, if it meant that a lot of things got traded. So, kind of unclear, but after queen a5, b6 was played, and then I went queen a6, and my new thought process was, well, since the b6 move is played and my bishop is now, you know, eyeing the a8 square, maybe I can try to play a4, a5, and get at the queen side that way on the a file because the rook can't challenge. So I thought that was kind of an option. But after queen a6, black played knight d5, and I think that's a very, very good move that kind of put a stop to that ambition. I thought here that now a4 didn't make so much sense because black now has the very good move knight b4, and I thought from b4, now that this knight would be kind of unassailable, it wouldn't be advisable for me to do this because he has such good dark square control. And my queen would be forced to move, let's say, queen c4, and now even a5 is an option, just cementing that knight on b4 and just ensuring that it's going to be very, very difficult for me to execute a pawn break. Note that if I do want to now play for d4, I'd have to go rook fd1 and prepare that even more, and maybe e3 and d4, and you know, it's just really, really tough with the knight being so active. So I thought that now with knight d5, a4 didn't make a lot of sense. And because of that, I went a3, just covering the b4 square, stopping a knight b4 push. But now it kind of begs the question, what is my queen on a6 actually doing here? So rook c7 was played. I think that's a good move, reinforcing the a7 pawn with the rooks, so now the queen does not have to guard it, and entertaining doubling rooks on the c-file. Good move. I went rook c2, considering doubling as well. And after rook dc8, I went rook fc1. And I was thinking, well, maybe I might have b4, d4 in the cards, and I'm keeping my options open. But you could see here that black is pretty well protected on c7, so it's going to be hard, you know, to really get anything going, even if I do go for one of my breaks. So after rook fc1, black now went knight e7, and I think this is actually a slight mistake because the knight on e7, on d5 is actually much better than it was on e7. Instead, a move like g6 makes a lot of sense to me. Just giving the king an escape square. Now there are no more back rank problems. And yeah, I think it's just a good move. And also in some positions, introducing h5. So if I go like rook c4, just kind of playing the waiting game, now h5 actually does, you know, seize some space on the king side. And who knows, maybe h4 is an idea that I have to be worried about. Trying to challenge my king side. Maybe there's some king g7, rook h8 business. I doubt it, but, you know, I think h5 just taking more space is important. And note the setup of the pawns on the king side on light squares. And the reason this is actually valuable is because I have a light squared bishop. You really limit my scope by keeping the pawns in the same color squares as my bishop. So anyways, knight e7 was played instead, and I went e3. And my reason for this was I thought, again, b4 was not very viable here. I was looking at these positions, but I thought after c takes b4, rook c7, and all the rooks come off, I thought that, yeah, I do have a little bit of pressure here, but it's hard to increase the pressure, and I just wasn't really buying it. I mean, this bishop is not really hitting anything, and if I move my queen, he might be able to initiate a passed pawn on the queen side, so I think it's actually just a position that's just close to equal, but no more than that. So instead, I decided to play e3 and entertain perhaps playing the move d4 at some point. Obviously not now, but it was something I was thinking about. So after e3, black went h6. That's, again, a reasonable move now, just giving himself an escape square. Again, I would prefer g6 just because in this line you're restricting the bishop, whereas with h6, your luft is a light square, and that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because it would mean that I could still play bishop e4 check. And so after h6, I got mildly excited and decided to play h4. And my thought process was that maybe I could consider playing h5 and fixing the pawns in the dark square so that the king doesn't really have security on h7 with a future bishop e4 check. After h4, black did go queen d6. And I actually thought here for a moment whether or not to play h5 or not. And h5 might have been interesting. Like, if I go h5, maybe he goes for knight d5 back, getting at the f3 pawn. And I think this was kind of the h5 pawn. I think that was kind of my concern, was I was a little bit worried about, playing bishop f3 to protect and then having to calculate like knight takes e3. And this really worried me because it seemed like he was getting 3 pawns for the piece and quite active. But now that I look at it, it's probably not that dangerous. White is still probably doing okay here, but it looks like they're perpetuals because I can't block with rook f2 because of queen takes c1. So the more I looked at it, the more I thought, well, if I play h5 and have to defend with bishop f3, it looks like my e3 and g3 pawns were a little bit sensitive after that sacrifice. So because of that, I actually didn't play h5, and I went for bishop e4. And this kind of pained me a little bit, I have to admit, because I really did want to go h5, but it just didn't seem to work. So after bishop e4, black went g6 now, and now my dreams of playing h5 and kind of shutting down his mobility kind of aren't, on the king side with the pawns, is not as attractive. Again, let's say after h5 he played g6 here. He wouldn't do this, so this would be a huge difference because now after takes, his pawn structure is shattered either way he takes. If he takes the knight, h6 is weak. If he takes with f7, then all his pawns are weak. So this is like kind of the savvy thing I was trying to do to create a weakness. But after g6, it puts an end to that. I now went queen c4 back, not really seeing what my queen was doing on a6 anymore. And again, kind of admitting that this b4 stuff that I was angling for didn't seem to have amazing returns. I mean, I just couldn't imagine with this position that I can really even pretend to make progress because I don't have any lever with my b pawn. And I mean, let's say worst case scenario, black just decides to shuffle. I mean, how do I improve here, honestly? Like, I'm just not sure how to improve. If the queen moves, then black will play a5. And otherwise, black is just very, very solid here, which is just the nature of the position. So instead, I decide to retreat and try to go for something else. Now, after queen c4, black played knight d5. And here I actually started to panic a little bit because the more I looked at the position, the more it kind of seemed like my queen was lacking squares. The queen right now only has b5 and a6 to go to. Oh, also a4. But I was already looking at scenarios where a move like knight b4 might be a problem. For instance, let's say king g2. Oh, not bishop g2. Let's say king g2 and now knight b4. And tactically, this kind of bothered me because if I take, all of a sudden my queen is kind of loose here. Now, in this variation, I'm actually fine because I get 2 rooks and knight for the queen. But there were some lines where if my rook moves away, so maybe I didn't illustrate it properly. Let's say rook d2. Knight b4 actually becomes a move. So that kind of concerned me. Another thing that concerned me was just that I didn't see much counterplay here. Like, right now, I can't play b4 or d4 because my queen is actually hanging after the capture. And the knight is actually covering the rook, so I would just get a rook and a knight for the queen. And yeah, I just didn't see. And also, the other thing that concerned me was this knight takes e3 stuff, right? So again, let's say I move back just to illustrate. Knight e3, fe3, queen g3. And at the very least, white is getting, well, rook g2 doesn't work because queen takes e3. But at the very least, black is getting 3 pawns for the piece here with check, maybe even 4 pawns. And, then I really have to consider my life choices because this would be a very, very dangerous position to go for. And it looks like there might even be a perpetual. So I was really, really worried about these factors. And because of that, I panicked and decided to play bishop takes d5, which is not on the face of it a good move. Pretty much by trading the bishop for the knight, I'm taking away any of the possible symbolic advantages I had having this bishop versus knight position. Because a move ago, we already see that black has a little bit more space than white. So the only thing I could really play for was the bishop versus knight advantage and the potential pawn breaks. But now after this capture, I don't even have that advantage. So very, very poor and double-edged decision, but it was kind of born out of the fact that I think I needed to assume a defensive posture given the sacrifice on e3. So after bishop takes d5, e takes d5, which is a good move, he actually corrects his pawn structure a little bit from the standpoint that now I don't even have a really good pawn break. Whereas if you played queen takes d5, if I just move the queen away, I'm actually going to have b4 or d4 as a really effective pawn break to actually open up the rooks on the c-file. And in this type of version, black actually does not have a pawn break because if you move the b pawn, you weaken c5. And if you push the e pawn, you potentially weaken some light squares in your position. So e takes d5 was a really good move just to cover up more squares. And now I realized I was kind of getting pushed off the board and losing space. And I was a little bit concerned that if I played queen c3 to drop back, black could now shift gears with a move like, first of all, starting with a move like h5 to fix this pawn structure on the king side. But then even consider moves like rook e7 and rook ce8, and maybe even rook takes e3 at some point as a sacrifice. So let's just say I dilly-dally just to give you an example. I thought all of a sudden this could come with devastating effect and that this type of situation could at least give black a draw, but maybe more. And once I saw these types of sacrifices, I was like, I'm not so fast. I'm not going for this. And so because of that, I thought, you know what? Better to keep my queen relatively active, and I went to f4 because at least now I can facilitate a trade and get to an endgame that I thought would be kind of safe. Now, I'm not better at all after this endgame, but I did think it was hard to lose. And I thought that my penchant for playing endgames pretty well would give me some semblance of play. So fortunately for me, Seth actually did take on f4, which was not necessary. And after g takes f4, went a5. And this actually precipitates a completely new kind of game because essentially now we're in a position where it's a rook endgame. Both sides might have potential breaks, but ultimately I think it would probably be better for both sides to kind of keep their posture a little bit. So the thing that's really good about a5 is it clamps down on my b4 break. But on the flip side, you're kind of weakening some of these squares a little bit. And yeah, I didn't think a5 was super impressive. Instead, I thought the move that black would play would be b5. Because now, you might say, well, doesn't this allow d4, b4? Well, either of those breaks just allows the move c4. And now the c-pawn would be protected and passed and would be a very, very bad recipe for white. Note that if I play a move like d4, not takes, like d4, this would be a huge mistake because now it actually allows a5. And all of a sudden, black could seize the initiative on the king side or on the queen side and have a really, really nice endgame with the protected pass pawn. So I didn't play, I thought b5 was a good move because it takes all the space and, it just kind of prevents my pawn breaks. Instead, after a5, I was happy because now I could fix the b pawn as being backward, and I went a4 to do that. And I thought now, in certain endgames, this one pawn will actually be controlling 2 pawns. So I just thought that was kind of a poor decision. So now after a4, king g7 was played. I went king g2, king f6, and king f3, and I thought the position should be relatively close to equal, but it actually seemed to me that it'd be a little bit easier to play white. And the reason for that is because I have these central pawns, which are decent, and these double pawns aren't actually as bad as they look, because it actually gives me the g file to operate with my rooks. Last but not least, I thought that I might have a pawn lever in this position connected to h5 to open up the h file. And if black decides to shut that down by playing a move like h5, then all of a sudden the g5 square is weak, so I can entertain a move like rook g1 and rook g5 to target the d5 pawn. So I thought that I had slight chances in this ending to kind of confuse Seth, and I felt kind of optimistic, actually. After king f3, black decided to play rook d7, which is a reasonable move, protecting the d5 pawn, just kind of waiting. I think that's actually the right choice here as opposed to playing this h5 stuff. But it does allow me some counterplay, and now I go for the move rook h1, kind of teasing out this h5 move, suggesting that I'm going to open up the position that way. Black now went for rook c7 back. I think that's fairly reasonable, arguing that now that my rook is now not on c1 like before, c4 is actually a threat trying to break open the queen side. Because if black is able to break open the queen side and get counterplay on these pawns, it's hard to imagine that I'll be able to get anything going on the king side. But I went h5 anyway, just because I thought it was my chance to kind of get counterplay on the h file. And now I have some ideas, because if I play h takes g6 now, well, then I'm actually hitting the h6 pawn, and f takes g6 wouldn't be possible. So I thought that I'd be in real business here, and if you go king takes g6, then the king is a little bit exposed, and the pawns would be split. So I thought, all of a sudden, it seems like white is getting a little bit of rub here. And I also want to note my king on f3 is a little bit more secure than black's king on f6, in part because of this weird fangled pawn formation from f2 to f4. So after h5, black went g5, trying to shut that down. But I didn't mind this because now I'm actually able to undouble my pawn. So I went f takes g5 check, and now after there was a kind of a critical decision that needed to be made, and unfortunately black went with the wrong decision. Why don't you try to pause the video and figure out which is the best way to recapture on g5. All right, hopefully you got a chance to figure out which way you'd want to capture on that square. The best way, and the way that Seth actually didn't play, is actually king takes g5. And king takes g5 looks a little bit counterintuitive because you keep your pawns split. But the point is, you actually keep my h-pawn kind of under control. And the key line is that after rook g1 check, king f6, and rook g4, you actually just go rook c6. And after a check on f4, king e7, you're actually ready to challenge this rook on f4 with rook f6 as needed. So if I go for rook f5, rook f6, and you stop my rook just before it's going to get too active. This would be enough to kind of keep the balance. Note that if I go king f4, trying to get my king really active so that if you take like this, my king's on f5, you actually have a better option and can go king e6. And now you actually control the opposition and don't allow my king to step up to f5. And this would be sufficient for black. Instead, after h takes g5, which was played, you keep your pawns connected, but now I have a very dangerous runner that manages to cause black some problems. So now I played king g4. First of all, I thought this was a great move, eyeing the g5 pawn as well, keeping the king relatively frozen on f6 because it has to defend this one, and also keeping the h6 idea alive. Note that h6 right away I was not too keen on because I thought after king g6, now the pawn could be quickly corralled with rook h8. So king g4 was a nice finesse, I thought, to kind of play a little bit of a waiting game. Now rook g8 was played, defending the g5 pawn and freeing the king on f6 to move, but white is starting to get somewhere. And in this position, they're actually many promising continuations. I wound up playing h6, but there are a lot of promising continuations. Another move that was quite promising was the move e4. And the point is that after d takes e4, I open up the d file for my rook to get some counterplay. And so you kind of have to stop that with rook d7. But now I actually have h6, and all of a sudden this pawn becomes a serious distraction. After rook d4, which would attack the e4 pawn, I can actually go h7, and this position is actually almost losing for black. The very natural rook takes e4 check would actually lose on the spot. Amazingly, I could not believe this when I saw it. But the point is that king h5 becomes terribly strong, in part because after rook h8, black now has king h6, and all of a sudden holds the opposition here and protects the h7 pawn. So if the king ever moves away, the white king steps into g7, and the h7 pawn goes through. And so now the king on f6 is frozen, and if you try to, block me from coming in, I do eventually get my c2 rook active, and amazingly, this type of position is already lost because the rook is just, paralyzed, and the king can't move. And note that, again, this a4 pawn holds the majority on the queen side. So amazing scenario, but, e4 was an option. Another move that was an option was actually f4. I was reluctant to play f4 just to give the rook the open g file, but actually after g takes f4 check and king takes f4, now this rook on c2 again can get activated very quickly, and if the king tries to support the h pawn or to stop it, my rook can very quickly come over to g2 with check and cause some problems. So after f4 and king takes, rook g5 tries to get some counterplay on the f5 square, but now again I can play e4, stopping rook f5 check, and after takes and rook d7 trying to get this one active, I have h6. And this h6 pawn is always this annoying distraction for black's pieces that manages to slow it down completely. In this position, black has a ton of problems because, again, this h pawn becomes a factor. And in this version, you can see that this endgame is just totally winning because rook h2 mate is a threat. And if you go king takes h7, well, now I can actually go king takes f7, and I'm still threatening this mate. And if you go here, you just lose a rook. So there were actually some real merit in other variations to not rush with playing h6 and actually opening one more file, whether it was the g file or the d file, by playing e4 or f4, that would have given me really significant decisive chances. So yeah, maybe something I should have recognized, given the fact that until I play h6, black doesn't really have any openings in the position anyway. So maybe it would have been decent to improve on one side. Instead, after h6, black played king g6, and that gave him the opportunity to scoot over, which was not the case in the position here, right? King g7 wasn't an option because it's hanging g5, and king g6 is just held. So a little bit of a missing the mark. But after king g6, now I went e4, and I thought now that the king had skirted away from the center, it would be a prime opportunity to open it up. So after e4, d takes e4 is played, d takes, and now rook e7 was played, and this move is a mistake. In part because it doesn't actually kind of control this h6 pawn. Instead, a better move was king h7, and this move would have held the game fairly easily. The point is now rook g6 becomes an idea in certain positions, and, well, it's still not totally clear, but after rook d2, c4 is a key move, prying open the position and getting the necessary counterplay to kind of get at my other pawns and make the king on g4 feel a little less secure. And after b takes e4, rook takes e4, and f3, I have to hold up the e4 pawn. Rook g6 effectively covers the b6 pawn in time for me to in time for my rook to invade on d6. And actually, this is still a tricky line because seeing this rook rook g6 move is not easy. And after rook d7, I am still threatening f7. And here there's another only move, rook f6, which defends the f7 pawn and also threatens rook f4 check. So those are kind of the key moves to see. And ultimately, black will hold this one because the king is firmly shut down the advance the h6 pawn, and these rooks are active enough where my king does not have total shelter security. So yeah, king h7 was a key move that was missed. Instead, after rook e7, I went f3, and now rook h8 was played trying to corral the h6 pawn. But the issue is that you didn't control this rook on c2, which was trying to get active all along. And so after rook h8, I went rook d2, and all of a sudden it's not so easy to stop this invasion on d6, where I not only eye my h6 pawn, but I also eye the b6 pawn. Now, instead of rook d2, there was actually another really, really attractive option, and it's actually the move rook h5, something that I had not really considered at all. Part of the reason it's so strong is because if you go rook takes h6 now, after rook takes g5, check, and king f6, there's actually rook d2, and this is actually an even better version, keeping both rooks on the board, because you can see my rooks are way more active than black's rooks right now. And rook e6 would have to be played to guard the d6 square, but now I have rook d8, and after rook c6 and rook f5 check, king e7, and rook b8, the pressure is still on with my rooks trying to converge on the f7 pawn, with my two connected passers here. If the pawn on f7 drops, it's completely winning. And again, you can see in this line just how difficult it is to mobilize black's queenside pawn majority because of the backward b pawn. So, yeah, that was another really concrete option. Instead, I went for, instead I went for rook d2. And, we had made the move 40. This was actually move 41. And I thought, well, to even get a position based upon that kind of dull position that we got after the queen trade, to get a rook endgame where I actually have really active pieces and the material is equal, I thought was a dream scenario. So I was quite pleased with even getting this far. Rook takes h6 was played, and after rook takes and king takes, I played king f5, and now the position is actually nearly lost, pretty much a lost position, because even though black is a pawn up, my king is more active and my rook is more active. So it's really, really difficult to stop the ideas of the rook d6 invading. Black actually only has one move here to hold the game. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure out what that is. All right, hopefully you got a chance to try and figure out this is black to move and save the game. The only move that draws here or holds the balance is the move king g7. And this is a tough move to make because you're not holding on to this g5 pawn. You're accepting that it's lost. But the point is that after king takes g5 and rook c7, you're not defending the b6 pawn horizontally. You're just trying to liquidate the entire queen side. And so the point is that after e5, black is going c4 after subsequent trade. Stopping me from going e6 here is very important, so I don't have two connected pass pawns. And after f4, b5. And this position is actually a draw because I can't really make progress pushing the pawn here because my king is pinned. And yeah, it's just a draw. It's just enough to draw. Note that if I play a move like king g4, now black can step back and doesn't have to worry about e6 anymore because there's no pin. So, yeah, this would be a draw by the hair of his chinny chin chin. Instead, after king f5, black played the move which is losing, which is rook e6. And I actually had a feeling when I went for this line after king f5 that this position was losing because of my next move, amazingly, e5. And miraculously, this position is won because now, after king g7, which was played, now I gain an important tempo on previous lines with the move rook d6. And amazingly, the issue is that you can't trade rooks because you have a losing pawn ending. So for instance, after rook takes d6, e takes d6, even though white is a pawn down here, black is totally compromised because he can't make use of his majority here. And after king f8 coming back to catch this pawn, I can take the one on g5. Now material's equal. And after king e8, king f6, and king d7, I actually have two attractive ways, but the really easiest way to win is now to just go king e5. And again, the point is that there's no way to make use of this majority effectively. Yeah, it's just a losing position. Note that if f6 now, I'll just go king d5, and this king, he'll very quickly lose opposition, and my king will invade. And if you try to give up the pawns by going like b5, I could take, and then whichever way you push, let's say you go c4 to keep the a pawn, which is further away from the king, I can now take this one, and after a4, I'm actually well in the square. So I can just go king d4, takes, king c3, king c5, king b2, and you can never take on c4 because, because essentially my b pawn will run, and so the king has to kind of go back. And after king, I can actually just, waste enough moves to actually win the game, and eventually just corral the a pawn. So, yeah, amazingly, the position after rook e6 is just the rook after rook d6 is just winning for white because you can't trade rooks. And because you can't trade rooks, you have to retreat your rook, and this gives me the much needed tempo to actually take on b6 before black has actually gotten off the c4 break in the previous line with the rook on c7. So I went rook takes b6, and the material's equal now, but you can also see both these pawns are weak. g5 is a problem, so yeah, black is actually in trouble. Black now played c4, which is a really, really smart try, and really the best chance to hold the game is to try to liquidate the queenside pawns. So c4 is a really, really brilliant attempt to do that, because after b takes c4, which is forced, now rook c7 is played, and the c4 pawn comes off the board. I now went king takes g5, trying to just secure the g5 pawn. And now rook takes c4 was played, and it still requires some precision from here, because you could see that black will win the a pawn, but the difference is that this rook on a4 is an extremely passive position, and my pawn is actually already quite advanced. I played rook b7, a very, very important move, pinning the f7 pawn, and this is actually a winning move because now e6 is a threat, threatening rook takes f7, getting two connected pass pawns, which would be winning. So black must play the move king f8, getting out of that potential e6 move. And here I actually played f4, now coming up with the pawns, and rook takes a4 was played. And this is actually the critical position of the game. This position, there's one way to win. And if you play it, you're winning. And if you don't, you're drawing. And unfortunately, I just mixed up the move order, which meant, and I gave black an opportunity to draw in a very, very instructive way. So why don't you pause the video here and try to find white to play and win. It's fairly elementary, but I missed it. All right, so in this position, I played the move rook a7, and rook a7 fails to a very, very specific tactical trick, which I'll actually allow you to think on. But first, I'll show you the winning move. The winning move is f5. And the point is now, actually, after king f6, you're threatening mate. And so the point is that black has to play rook b4 to try and get to the 6th rank and challenge the king. And after rook a7, rook b6 is extremely important. And now the point is you stop my king from coming to f6, but I can still win the game by going rook takes a5. And after king e7, I have rook a7 check, king e8, rook a6 check, king e7, f6 check, king e6, and then rook e8. And this forces the king too far away to protect f7. So after the king, moves to d5, well, this position is just losing. I can just go for a move like king f5. And the issue is now I'm threatening rook d8 check, pushing the king away even further to the c file, and then I can come back and attack the f7 pawn, and this would be won, with the king being cut off. Instead, in this position, after rook a7, black has a fabulous resource that draws. And really, this could go in the study book. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure out black to move and draw. All right, hopefully you got a chance to find this move. This is amazing. Really give yourself a pat on the back if you found this. The move that black played here that holds the game is the amazing f6 check. And it's a move that as soon as it was played, I had realized what I had done. Because now I can't actually take on f6 with the pawn because now my king will not have the appropriate shelter to actually give the checkmate. And this position is actually just a dead draw. Unfortunately, there's no recourse here. After a move like rook a1, if I ever step up to give checkmate, to try and give checkmate, he can just play rook g1. And I can hide, but the point is that, I can't make any further progress here. And in fact, I'm not even sure the a pawn is really necessary anymore. Even this type of position, I think, is just a draw. So, amazing situation where I actually spoiled my pawn duo. And again, if I play king takes f6, I actually hang the pawn on f4 with check. So yeah, I just threw it away. So the key thing is I actually was thinking of going. I thought rook a7 first was clever because I actually stopped this rook b4 idea because I could take on a5. But it actually turns out that the a pawn is not a factor, and I should have gone f5 right away. Because after rook b4, rook a7, we would just transpose to a line from before. I don't know what I was thinking. I guess I was thinking that by playing rook a7 first, I prevented the rook from moving from the a file. But this f6 move was a huge shock to my system. After f6, I played king takes f6. I thought this was the best way to try to win. And after rook takes f4, I went king e6. And this position I still thought was kind of tricky because if I'm able to establish my king on e8 and my pawn on e7, that position I know is winning because I can build the bridge. I don't recall the name of that position, but that rook endgame I probably should. But the point is if you have your king on e8 and your pawn on e7, you can use your rook and shield the king on the 5th rank and then queen your pawn. So I was kind of aiming for that, but remarkably, my opponent here actually knew this rook endgame in and out. It's quite clear he studied this endgame in depth, and because he was playing all of his moves instantly. He was blitzing out this rook moves in this rook ending from here on out, and I thought that was extremely impressive. And he didn't even worry about holding on to his a pawn. So after king e6, he went rook e4. And after rook takes a5, I was like, okay, I have some pretty good chances here because, again, if I get my king to e8 and my pawn e7, I'm gravy. But now black played rook e1 very, very confidently. And here actually is part of the problem is I can't actually get my king to e8 without checking this king on f8 away. And when I check the king away, my e pawn is actually hanging. So the idea is for this rook to just constantly keep an eye on the e pawn and otherwise to harass me with checks if I step out. And this is actually enough to draw the game amazingly. We played several more moves, but really this guy Seth Homa, he played all of the moves in this rook endgame instantly and is extremely impressive. So I'll show you what that looked like. Rook A8, king G7, rook D8. I don't know what I was doing there. I can kind of hoping this rook left the D file so my king could go to E7, but of course it did not. He sat there and waited. I shuffled a little bit, and then I went there, and then the king goes back. And so as soon as my rook left the 8th rank, the king comes back to stop my king from walking up. So now I'm kind of dancing again. I dance, then check from the other side. The king comes, and I move my rook, but you can see I can't move my king up with the rook eyeing the e-pawn. So we moved a little bit more, and then after rook d6, I actually offered him a draw because it was quite clear that he'd known how to handle this one in and out. So it was a really tough game to draw, in part because I did feel like I'd outplayed him to just get to this winning rook ending, and it was quite a shame that right at the end of the conversion I messed it up. And this has actually been a theme in some of my games at some point over the course of the year, particularly a bit later in the year. You'll see that I have these grinded out games where I do the grind really, really well, and then a few moves before victory, I kind of let them off the hook. And so I need to be a little bit more precise just at the moment when I think the game is over, because there are always a few little tricks at the end. And this one was a good one to learn and understand, to be wary of those double pawns in rook endgames, because the 2 double pawns on the f-file after this f6 check meant that I couldn't win. So anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.